designed to share something with the admissions committee that they're not necessarily going to know about you otherwise. And the supplements allow you to be a little bit more surgically precise about what it is you're actually talking about.
Welcome back to the podcast. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Today, I'm talking with a group of really experienced writing coaches and college consultants about supplemental essays. I'm always excited to have this discussion. We do it every August, I would say, because it is something that is often really overlooked by parents and students as they're going through the process. When they imagine the college admissions process, they're imagining, oh, I just got to write this one big and important college essay. And that's the thing that they're really focused on. But oftentimes when we roll around to this time of year, they're in a good place with their college essay. And then all of a sudden, they start seeing these supplemental essays crop up and pile up to just an enormous number. And it can get really stressful and overwhelming, both to just know what you need to do and to know how to do it. So I love convening some of my writing experts to discuss this and help families know where to start, how to keep it organized, and how to streamline this process so that it doesn't just kill the end of your summer. All right, with that, I'm going to tune you into our panel discussion. I'm Sheila. I'm the CEO of Signet Education. I run the business, but I do take on a number of students and I work with this team, whom I'll let themselves introduce themselves in just a moment, to help students and their families through the application process from start to finish. So we do a ton of college application work with rising seniors. Now that the school year has started for some of you, they're officially seniors, but we also start much earlier than that, helping students plan their courses, prepare for standardized tests, plan extracurriculars, maybe get some executive function support or, regular old subject tutoring to get through a difficult class in high school. So we like to think of ourselves as a one-stop shop for anything you need to navigate high school. First, I'm going to ask my co-presenters, my panelists, to introduce themselves, and I'll just call on you in the order you are on my screen. Joanna, tell us a little bit about what you do at Signet and your background.
Hi, everyone. Wonderful to connect with you all. I'm Joanna Graham. This is my second full admission cycle working with the Signet team, but this is actually my 23rd cycle working with high school students on undergrad applications. My background is in standardized testing, higher ed, and a random smattering of certification products. In a former life, I was also chief marketing and product officer, and so really love bringing a lot of that richness around branding and storytelling to working with students on the college admissions process.
Thank you. Holly, you're next.
All right. I'm Holly Schreiber. Wonderful to be here with you all. So I've been with Signet, I think 6 years now, thereabouts, or was it 5? Well, we'll debate about that later.
I dug you up during the pandemic because you finally got Facebook. Holly
Okay,
and I
so
went to
five,
grad school
five
together.
years.
We've known each other forever, but she was out of touch for a little while until,
I
yeah.
was. And I do admissions work, the writing and consulting, academic coaching, and test prep work. In my previous life, I was a professor of communication and journalism, and I also studied comparative literature. So I love working with future college students on getting them prepared and ready for college. And I think these applications are one of the best ways we have to really get them ready.
Thank you. Alex.
Hey everybody, I'm Alex Greco, and I've been with Signet for a little over a year now, so this is my second cycle. I previously was a teacher of literature and writing, especially creative writing at the secondary level for a little over a decade before joining the Signet team, and I'm really happy to be here.
Thank you. And last but not least, Andy, bring us home.
Sure. Andy Friedman. I'm very happy to be here as well. I like Holly. I'm a recovering academic. I've been here one more year than Holly, and I think I wear one less hat than Holly. I don't do college consulting, but I do the writing part of it, as well as a bunch of test prep and academic coaching and humanities coaching generally. And this is, I think, my fourth or fifth season with Signet, the application season.
Great. Well, you all in the audience are really lucky. You really have the Signet All-Stars here, and they do amazing work with students, and I'm so excited for them to share a little of their insight with you today and answer some of your questions. So before we get into that, I am going to just ground us in like, what are we talking about? As I mentioned in kind of my introduction, we're talking about the supplemental essays today, the overlooked prompts that really do unlock acceptance, and I'll explain why in just a moment. When we think of the college application, we think of the college essay, the personal essay or the personal statement, Common App essay, whatever you may call it. It's the one kind of main essay that's really about who the student is. It's not about any particular school. And if you're using a platform like the Common Application, it's going to go to all the schools that you apply to, right? So it really does need to be about the student and not one school, because that would be weird to send it to a school that you're not writing about. We did a session on the personal essay at the beginning of the summer, which is when I recommend students start that, though I know the reality is many of them are probably just starting now, or maybe thinking about starting if they haven't started yet. So if that's the situation, please go to our YouTube channel or email me and I'll send you the link. And take a look at that earlier session where we talk about what's the purpose of this essay? What are they really looking to hear? How can students get started? What happens when you're stuck? How do you know when you're done? And some really great questions from the audience as well on the personal essay. In addition to the personal essay, there are other little bits and bobs of writing that go into the college application. On the Common Application in particular, there's a section called Additional Info. This year, they've shortened it to 300 words, and that's really for an objective treatment of, things that may not be clear in the application. This is not an additional personal statement or some other kind of persuasive essay. This is, I got hit in the head at a soccer game and I had a concussion and I was out for 2 weeks and then I was a little behind in my classes, but I worked really hard and I worked with my teachers and I caught up and I maintained my grades, right? It's for factual information that will help an admissions officer understand the context that they're seeing everything else in. The Common App also has what's called a challenges and circumstances essay. This was actually introduced during COVID and they called it the COVID interruption essay or something like that. And then it became like a community disruption essay. This year they've changed it to challenges and circumstances. And these are meant to be things like there was a natural disaster, there was a global pandemic, things like this that are affecting my ability to go to school. And the more specific sort of, I got a late diagnosis of ADHD really belongs in the additional information section. Now, this is all very nuanced, and this is someone you really want to talk to an expert with about your specific situation. So if anything I've said here kind of like rings a bell for you, please reach out. We're happy to coach you through how to use these and how your student might write something for those sections. But today we're going to talk about the supplemental essays. Now, these are not required by every college. Some colleges have lots of these. Some colleges have 0 or maybe 1, or maybe they have 2, but they're optional. And that doesn't mean they're not important, right? Whether a college has supplemental essays at all and how many they have is really part of their strategic decision making of how do we set up the right barriers so that the right students are applying and we don't just get spammed with a lot of bad applications that are not a good fit for our university? Or how do we remove those barriers so we get as many applications as possible and we can drive our admittance rate down and look more selective in the rankings, right? So it's not that they're not important. It's just a tool that colleges use to build or erase barriers and get to know your student in a less formal way than that personal essay, and in a more specific way than that personal essay. As you'll hear, we talk about some of the prompts and what are the keys to writing these essays. There we're looking for specific information that shows that a student understands the school that they're applying to, and more importantly, understands how they fit in that community, right? This is really about belonging in terms of you have the programs I want to study, or you bring these sorts of people together and I feel like I'm one of those people. Let me tell you stories that really prove that I belong on your campus. Or your mission statement really resonates with me and let me tell you why. These are the kinds of specific things you want to be able to say in response to a supplemental prompt. Okay, we have some grounding and I'm going to open my first question to the panel. I told you a little bit about the purpose of these supplements, but let's get into a little more detail. And I want to start with you, Joanna, if we can. When you're reading applications, and I know you were reading at Georgetown, which technically doesn't have supplemental applications because until this year, they were not on the Common Application. So everything you wrote to Georgetown was specifically to Georgetown. But when you were looking at an essay that was sort of this supplemental type, what were you looking for? What were you hoping to hear from students?
But the number one thing that I was looking for was what you kind of hit the nail on the head earlier, Sheila, was fit. But what fit means is I was looking for specifically, has the student done their homework? Have they been to the website? Do they know what our values are? Do they understand what the mission of the university is? And can they tie that to them? Are there things in their background? Are there activities? At Georgetown, I'll give you a perfect example. The number one extracurricular activity for admitted students for the last 20 years and counting now is community service or volunteer work. And if you've researched Georgetown, you will know that that aligns very closely with these values around cura personalis, the Jesuit philosophy, so much about what the university sort of holds to be true. And so when you're thinking about supplemental essays and when you're thinking about what you can do to sort of stand out, the number one thing you can do is actually sort of use some of that research muscle memory that you've been building up in high school and start treating the university as your next research project.
That's great. Andy, since you're next on my screen, would you add anything to that?
I certainly wouldn't change anything. That's a pretty perfect summary. I think that for many of the supplements, and I'm sure we'll talk about the standard sort of collection of supplement types, the why us? Why do you want to come to this university is obviously the most pertinent here. My first step with students is do your research. And there's a number of great ways to do research and some not so great ways. Obviously, the school website is central, but it's also the outward facing part of the university. Sometimes it can feel rather opaque. A lot of university websites, missions, or like university mission statements, and the language all over the websites are basically the same, just different permutations of the same words like community, intellectualism, and values and stuff like that. So you do have to dig a bit deeper sometimes. The other ways to do research is obviously the campus tour, if possible, college fairs. And another one that I really like is to go on sites like Reddit and Quora, where a lot of alums will talk about, oh, this is kind of the nitty gritty, the behind the scenes stuff, where you can really get a sense of what a school is really about. And that helps sort of cut through what can be, the sort of opaque, homogenized language that you'll get elsewhere.
Yeah, that's a really great point. Sometimes I'm sitting with my students and they're like, every college says the same thing. How do I tell them apart? Beyond what you just said there, I always encourage them to talk to people they know who've gone there, right? So like Reddit or Quora might be a way to do that if you don't know anybody, but those websites can be a bit of a rabbit hole. So we want to be careful.
You have to be careful about,
Yeah, for sure. But no,
credibility.
it's a great source, right? Because we want multiple sources and you can't just take the college for their word of, oh, we're great at, X. Like you really want to hear from a lot of other sources to corroborate that. So that's great. Thank you for dropping us into sort of how do we get this information in the first place. Holly, tell me what you think about supplemental essays.
Yeah, I'll underline something Joanna said as well as values. In doing your research, you'll hopefully understand the values of the school, but also make sure that you have a pretty firm grasp on what you think your primary values are and how those might connect with the school's mission. So rather than just parroting back their value statement, making sure that you're very clear about how the things you do and the things you care about align in a unique way, hopefully, and so it doesn't sound like every other supplemental essay out there.
Perfect. Alex, anything to add?
Yeah, I think what's lovely about the supplementals is that you have the opportunity to hit on some information that may, as we've kind of said, allow the school to project into the future and imagine who you'll be on campus in a way that's a little bit more intimate and more colorful than just relying on the one central essay. And I think for students, although there might be a lot of, or it might feel like there's a lot of supplemental essays to write, what can be really empowering is if there are bits and pieces of themselves that don't get captured in that main personal essay, this is the perfect opportunity to recycle those little bits, those tidbits about yourself that are still important elsewhere in the application.
You set me up perfectly. I promise we didn't plan this, but that's literally the next question. A lot of students are worried about trying to cram in this like very full, robust picture of themselves in the personal essay. And sometimes it just doesn't fit, right? We can't put every story, impactful value, or experience into one 650 word essay. I mean, that would be a bad essay, right? So we tend to focus on sort of a small moment that reveals something significant about a student, and we keep it to kind of one story. But all of that other great stuff should go somewhere. And the supplements are, as you said, Alex, a great opportunity to do that, right? So let's talk about some of the prompts. You guys have all mentioned the why this school prompt, right? And I know there was a specific question about that in the chat already. Somebody's is like really struggling with that, which is totally common. Don't worry, you're right on track. But let's talk about what some of the other prompts look like. Alex, since you were just sharing with us, what are some of your other favorite or most common supplemental prompts that you see?
I don't know if it's very common, but I saw one last cycle that I thought was interesting and maybe a little bit challenging that asked a student to describe in very few words like what their like recent Saturday was like. And I think that that one could potentially be a little bit tricky because students are actually inclined to just word for word explain what they did on a Saturday. But I think it is prompts like that that could potentially give them a flavor for who a student is on a day-to-day basis and welcome the reader into their personal life. And so I know with the student that I worked on that prompt with, we ended up talking really about the relationship with her and her younger brother, especially as she's getting ready to go off to college through the lens of like them making waffles one morning. So I think those kind of interesting, colorful prompts might throw you at first, but they can really offer the opportunity to give glimpses into things that students wouldn't necessarily think they should be writing about, but actually give a lot of good information about who they are as a person and what their relationships are like.
You're so right. And it's probably wise to mention that these supplemental prompts can look like write us a 300-word essay on your ideal college experience. They could be give us, 25 words on your Saturday, or, I have seen a couple that are like, what are the 5 words you'd use to describe yourself? But there's a college that asks for a top 10 list, and it can be your top 10 list about anything, like your top 10 favorite shows or your top 10 favorite shoe brands, whatever it may be. So they are really throwing different formats out there to try to get a different sense of the student. That's really great. I'm glad you brought that up. Holly, what are some of your favorite prompts?
I think the most common one that I've seen is some version of our campus is a diverse community. Please describe one community that you're part of and how you'll contribute to campus. I've seen, it feels like that shows up for almost every student that's applying to schools that has supplementals. And I like for people to see that. Like, I think sometimes people shoot ahead to be like, oh no, they want to ask like, how am I diverse? Or, like, oh, okay, I know what they want. I don't know how to do it. And they panic a little. But that question is really about how do you treat other people around you? How do you see yourself as part of something larger than yourself? It could be family, a team, it could be a friend group. You keep going larger and larger. So I think that sometimes, again, going back to values and the kind of person you are, even if you're the shy person that's not, doesn't join clubs, doesn't feel like you're any part of a group, what is the next largest concentric circle around you that you relate with and that you contribute to, and you can write that essay. So I think sometimes and you can write actually a really beautiful and unique essay that's going to be very different from other people's. So but anyway, that's a common type. Starting last year, I think it was extremely common, and I think most of those have remained this year as well.
Yeah, that's a good one to bring up. It is super common. And to your point about, the shy kid who's not that involved, I had one of those a couple years ago, and she ended up writing about how she's part of this global community of ice cream fanatics. And she wasn't really like, message board, making friends and whatever, but, she went to every ice cream parlor she possibly could. And she always saw people who loved ice cream just as much as she did. And, it was a really interesting way to address that because she did feel part of that community. Joanna, talk to us about some of the supplements you've seen.
I'll go with the what do you want to study and why, or tell us about something that, academic that excites you about our university. Because I think this one can be exciting for students because when they're thinking about their personal statement, so many students are thinking, well, again, you kind of talked about sort of that kitchen sink mentality earlier. You're like, well, I have to cram in everything. What if they don't know I want to study astronomy and I want to study, be a liberal arts major and I want to do this? This essay is now your opportunity to talk about the things that you are passionate about from an academic perspective. On the flip side, for students who are undecided, this essay honestly can be their worst nightmare because they don't know how, in a very sort of creative and succinct way to explain that there are a lot of different things that they're interested in, especially if they're limited on word count. And so this is one of those essays that I really encourage students to think about when it comes to intellectual curiosity, really thinking about digging deeply and thinking about what are the things that do excite you, because that sometimes is very different from what do you actually want to be when you grow up and what do you actually want to study. And for many students, and especially those who are struggling to pick between two, and I know, and we'll probably get into this at some point too, I know that sometimes you'll have students who are applying as a different major to different schools, and they're thinking a little bit about the strategy and potentially if there's a gameplay angle there. I really encourage students to try to dig deep and think about more so than the topic. So it's not necessarily about saying, I want to be a psychology major, or I want to be, I want to study astronomy. But really think about what is it about these topics or these subjects that really does inspire and make you curious about learning, and focus a little bit more on that, because that will now show a school that you're not necessarily going in with just one thing in mind. And if you do end up going potentially undeclared, it helps the school understand a little bit more about your mindset and the things that do inspire you, the things that are, that you do find interesting. And so they'll be less likely to sort of perceive you potentially as someone who just doesn't have it quite figured out just yet, but rather maybe someone who does have some diverse interests that are connected maybe in some very unique ways.
That's great advice. Andy, talk to us about another prompt that we haven't talked about yet.
Yeah, I think we've done a good job of covering some of the most common ones. And we actually do behind the scenes have, I think Holly initiated this project of categorizing every supplement into a type, whether it's the diversity slash community one, whether it's the academic interest one, whether it's something about your background or an extracurricular that's especially important to you, or what brings you joy, right? These are sort of, they're right there, sort of, and the why us are probably the five most common. But then there's the fun ones that are really one-offs. The one that comes to mind, I don't think it really exists in the same form anymore, is University of Vermont, the Ben and Jerry's question. If you were to design a Ben and Jerry's style ice cream, and speaking of ice cream flavor that, embodies you, what would it be? And I remember they gave you quite a lot of room, at least 300 or 400 words. And it was just a wonderful opportunity for students to have some fun for once in this process and be creative, but also be strategic in what does this kind of flavor say? What aspect of my background or identity? Maybe they took sort of an ethnic cultural approach to something. Maybe they made some sort of texture metaphor with grit and resilience. I don't know. But there were a lot of cool ways to answer that question. They still have an ice cream question, but it has to do now with sort of how you would bring attention to some social or environmental, some problem in the world. So it's lost a little bit of its fun. The sprinkles have been shed, so to speak, but it's still ice cream after all.
Yeah. And I mean, I think what you were just saying made me think of what I would bring up that's separate from what all of you have said about these very common prompts. Colleges more and more are wanting to see if students are in touch with the world, right? They're asking questions about what is a social issue that is important to you and how have you been involved in trying to remedy it? Or USC asked this question that feels so impossible to kids. If you had 10 minutes and the attention of 1 million people, what would you talk about? Geez, wow, what a question. And then, there are other questions that are sort of like that are really trying to see, is this a student who is just kind of in their own bubble and just doing, what is asked of them? Or are they curious about the larger world? Do they understand or have a vision for how they want to be involved in the broader world, right? So that's another piece of this that I think is important to keep in mind. So as we're talking about these prompts, I imagine a lot of the parents on this call are like, oh, but we're writing about the academic interest in the personal essay, or my student is writing about their most favorite extracurricular in their main essay. How do we go about deciding what belongs in a personal essay and what might be better for a supplement? I know that
is very nuanced and is going to be very dependent on each student. But, I think that's a broader question that maybe we could shed some light on. Joanna, what do you think about that?
I think it is very student specific. And a lot of students that I work with will sometimes will have maybe two versions of a personal statement. They'll have one that they write that is for schools that have no supplements because they want to be able to talk a little bit more about an area of academic interest, for example. I think that's a great example. And actually, I'll just build on that for a moment. There are sometimes students, will start down a path in high school and they'll think that I really want to be a STEM major. I'm all about engineering and computer science. Their profile reads that way. And then all of a sudden, junior year, they go off and they take a psychology course or an English, a creative writing course, and they come back and it's all liberal arts. And it's challenging because their profile doesn't necessarily match with what they now want to study. And so sometimes students can use the personal statement there to maybe talk about that pivot and that change, but again, through the lens of that evolution of the journey. And so it's a little bit less sort of why I want to be an English major, but more about, hey, I started off really hardcore STEM and, I had this wonderful period of reflection and transformation. And that's what the personal statement addresses in some ways. And then other students, if you have the luxury of having those supplements where where you can sort of spread out a lot of these ideas and these different points, I think the biggest differentiator is when you think about the personal statement is just that. It is personal. It is talking about, it's designed to share something with the admissions committee that they're not necessarily going to know about you otherwise. And the supplements allow you to be a little bit more surgically precise about what it is you're actually talking about. So when they ask about things like, what do you want to study and why, you can be a little bit more tactical. This is where sometimes where students, if there's a professor that they are dying to study with and who's doing research in an area that that they're really interested in, this might be where some of that research comes in. You wouldn't necessarily cite that in your personal statement, but you could cite that, for example, in a supplemental essay. And the one caveat I'll throw out there is I always tell students, it's not about showing a school how great of a researcher you are. So you don't want to just go out and list like 7 random facts you found on their website, but it's, less is more here. So if you found a professor who's doing research in an area, for example, that you're really passionate about, mention that, but then talk about your passion passion in that particular area. So again, it's coming back and tying to something that is really core to your values and something that's really important to you. And I think Holly mentioned this in her first set of remarks, that it's, it's really it's really bringing to life and making you a bit more three-dimensional as an applicant and showing your passions and values.
Thanks. Let's go to Holly. Holly, what do you think about this question? How do you decide what's in the supplement?
What, and this is like so typically me. I say keep it loose for a little while. Don't be too rigid until like in saying the personal statement is done until you've looked at all the supplement prompts, right? I do have usually meetings with students where we pull all of the supplemental prompts and we look at them, and it's a lot and it's daunting, but you can go through and say like we have these threads that repeat a lot. Look how many essays are talking about academic interests. Uh-oh. Not disaster, but like I always say, like resonate and don't repeat. Can we write an essay about academic interests that is going to resonate but not repeat information from the personal statement? Is it different enough? Or do we have to pull from the personal statement? And then I'd say sometimes in the process of looking at supplementals, an idea crops up that could be a second idea for a personal statement that was perhaps actually more original and unexpected and surprising. And so it has happened with some of my most successful applicants that they did end up shifting to a different personal statement idea once we looked at their application packages, especially if it's a school that has a significant number of supplements, then it's worthwhile to consider. And by the time you've written a personal statement and then edited it, it's going to take half as long or less to do the next one. You've learned how to do it. You know what's expected of you. It's not like you're going back and doing the same exact thing over again. So I'm sorry if that happens, if you find those like repeats, but it happens quite often in our work and it's not the end of the world at all.
Yeah. In fact, Holly and I have a student we just did this with. She had an idea she really wanted to share, but she just didn't have that much to say about it. Whereas this other idea, she had a ton to say. And we were like, hey, let's just problem. And she freaked out for like maybe 5 seconds. And then she was like, oh, I see. I see how this is going to work. Right. So Holly's advice of looking at everything together, it's a constellation of content that we are putting together. And I love that phrase, resonate, don't repeat, right? We don't want to waste space. This is such valuable real estate to be able to speak in your own words directly to an admissions officer about what's important to you. You don't need to say it twice. You don't need to repeat what's on your activity list. You don't need to repeat what's in your transcript because that's there already for them to look at. This is a place to give them something new and a little bit more depth. And so considering all these things together, I think can be really, really helpful. Let's keep moving because I want to leave some time for questions. Though, of course, Andy or Alex, if you have something you really want to say, we can come back to it. Let's talk about some do's and don'ts for supplements. So Alex and Andy, we'll start with you both. Let's go. Alex, do's and don'ts, just a couple. What comes to mind?
I mean, I think one really maybe obvious one is like, don't feel like you need to shove everything into one of these smaller prompts. I think Joanna's advice of like surgical precision, especially if you understand what exactly the prompt is asking of you, which is sometimes clear and sometimes it's like for the example that Saturday prompt, like sometimes it's a little bit more hidden, but understanding like what are they trying to elicit from you and really giving that information and giving quality rather than quantity of examples is probably a good way to go.
It's a great one. Andy, what are your do's and don'ts?
Yeah, this is sort of touched on, I think, by Joanna. Don't try to flatter the university. Don't try to kiss up. They know everything about themselves. Those essays are all about, I think, as Joanna said, is showing that you are aligned in some deep ways, whether it's values, whether it's opportunities, academic or campus life and stuff like that. So don't waste time just sort of telling them stuff that they already know. Avoid cliches. I mean, this is just advice for life, but all the more so for both the personal essay and any supplements. We don't want any eye rolling when these admissions officers are reading these essays. I can go on, but
Yeah, no,
there's a
let's
couple.
cap it there. Holly, what would you say? What's your best advice?
I would say, well, knowing what the question is asking, definitely don't just say what you think they want you to say, right? Like if it doesn't feel like it's backed up by your actual convictions and personal experience. So there's like a civility essay, we sort of say that's floating around. It's like, how do you handle difficult conversations with people you disagree with? And if you don't do that, right? If you shy away from disagreement or something, you don't have to make up something or stretch, find a way to answer a question that is situated in your own experience and values. And that challenge of doing that will make it stand out more than having a very flimsy or unsupported, answer to the question that doesn't really fit you.
That's a good point. I have so many kids looking at that prompt being like, but I don't fight with my teachers. I don't get into like, these big debates online or whatever. And I'm like, but I bet you don't always agree with your parents. I bet you get really annoyed with your little brother. Let's talk about these times. And they're like, oh, I'm not my best self. And I'm like, well, let's talk about the self you wish you were in those moments. We're not going to lie. We're not going to sugarcoat it. But like, this is a great opportunity to reflect on that, right? How do you handle conflict? And what are you going to bring to this campus as your principles for kind of navigating that? Joanna, do you have any do's and don'ts?
Tangentially related to this, but I always tell students, don't hijack the prompt and tell a story that you think that, some random detail that didn't make it into your personal statement, or maybe it's a supplemental essay you wrote for another school that you love because it really highlights a great experience or an accomplishment. Don't hijack the prompt and shoehorn another essay or some other content in there to try to make it fit, so square peg, round hole type of mentality. I have a lot of students who will be really bummed because they're like, well, I want to talk about this really great research, project that I did or something that I'm really proud of, and I don't have anywhere to, so let me put it in the civility essay and talk about how initially maybe my parents didn't want me to go off and do this project and I did it anyway. And it's very, very tenuous at best. And so, really, I think this again aligns very nicely with what some of my other wonderful colleagues have said is, answer the prompt as it's written. Don't try to manipulate it to something else.
That's a good one. Yeah. If I have to add one thing, something I often tell students is that your supplemental essay should tell the school more about you than about the school. right? We want to check the balance of that, right? So you can mention the major you want to do, the professors you want to study with, the clubs you want to join, but we have to have more of the essay talking about the why you want to do those things, like what you've done that's similar to that already in high school, or a club that you've gotten involved with and you have gotten so just passionate about whatever that thing is that you want to continue doing it. You want to continue being involved in it. And by the way, University of Michigan has this great club where I can do that, right? It's kind of like a 2/3, 1/3 balance. We really want to be learning about the student, not about, some obscure thing you found about the university. But it's important that these things match, right? So you can't write a supplemental essay about how much you love field hockey for a school that doesn't have a field hockey team or a club or intramural field hockey, right? They'll be like, well, why are you applying here? You should go, wherever, right? So doing your research is another really, really important one. The research comes first, right? So we have really concrete things to organize our thoughts around. Okay, we have alluded to the fact that there are so many essays to write. I'm working with a student this year. This is actually where the title for this webinar came from. He actually has 54 separate supplemental essays to write. But as we looked at them and kind of identified those themes that Andy was talking about, and Holly, you've talked about as well, it came down to, I think, 15, which is so much more manageable, right? But how do we figure out those categories and how we can reuse information? And more importantly, how do we keep it organized so we know what the plan is for each of those schools? And how do you, I'm putting like 5 questions into this one question, but how do you sequence it? Right? Because there's going to be some early schools, there are going to be some regular decision schools, there are going to be some schools that have a longer version of the academic interest essay and some shorter. So where do we start? Once we've kind of identified, all right, these are the themes I need to write about, how do you create a project plan essentially around these supplements? Joanna, I'll start with you because I know you love being organized.
I'm very type A. I'm actually going to start, I think, by just calling out the fact that one of the things that I do before we even start getting, once we sort of organize kind of by content or sort of by subject area, I actually have students prioritize schools into tiers. And the reason being that is, as you all probably know, students are applying to more and more schools every year. And I tell every student, it doesn't matter who you are. The very best students are going to run out of steam at some point. And so it's really, really important that, if you're tier 1 or if your A school, has seven prompts, then we probably need to be prioritizing that. And then obviously recognizing, are there other places where we can use that content, and we build sort of a matrix to sort of align all of this. But it's really important before you do any of this to sort of chunk schools out. And I usually will suggest to students that they pick anywhere from 3 to 5 tiers, and they prioritize the schools. And there are different factors that can go into how you prioritize them. But for some students, and I'll use a school like Stanford as a great example, they're incredibly selective. And they also have a handful of short answer and supplemental essays. I believe last year it was somewhere around 6 or 7. For many students, because they're looking for, and some of these questions are also very, very specific. So I will suggest to students for some of these schools, like the Stanfords or the Yales of the world or the Browns of the world, where there are several short answer questions, it's not to say don't apply to these schools, but mix them up. Don't put all of those super selective schools in tier 1, because at some point you are going to run out of steam. And it would stink if you got to sort of your tier 2 or your target schools that you really, really do love, and where we feel like you are a really strong match. And you're starting to burn out because you've been writing so many supplemental essays that all belong with some of these other schools. So I think that's probably the first step I always encourage students to really think about is, how do you organize the schools in terms of sort of your personal order of preference or your priorities, so that you don't run out of steam by the time you get to November or December. And honestly, a lot of my students, that last tier, so whether it's tier 3 or it's tier 5, sometimes they call that sort of the punting lot, which is a horrible pun on parking lot. But they'll say, hey, if we get here and I'm just frazzled and burnt out, I'm just going to punt these schools. And sometimes for the early schools, it may mean punting to regular decision. But for the regular decision, if they're bumping up, again, it's all about trade-offs. If they're bumping up against final exams or, or other commitments they have at school, it may just mean saying goodbye to some of those schools as well, too, so that they can invest more time and energy into other schools that really do matter. So it's really important to not spread yourself too thinly. So I'll offer up that sort of piece of organization, even even sort of a predecessor or precursor to all the other organization. But I'll pause there because I want to make sure that I can give my colleagues some airtime as well too. But hopefully that's helpful.
That's great. Yeah. Alex, I'm curious how you think about this.
I mean, I have to defer to the consultants on the webinar today, but I think as a writing specialist and just as someone who also requires some visual strategy, I think that one thing that we do really well is support students through like actually having a visual mapping of the schools, the timelines, the prompts. And I think that it's something that helps when I get in there and try to work on the writing. It's one less thing that I and the student have to worry about when we talk about the actual, ideation and the drafting. Knowing that we already have that in a spreadsheet, it's like color coded, it's really clear. That's so helpful. It puts us at ease, and then we can really focus on the work that we're there to do. And it actually thanks everybody who creates those with the students, because I think then it allows us to like actually have fun when we're writing and talking, and it allows the student to see possibilities and to like maybe even enjoy themselves a little bit.
I love hearing that because I am always the big proponent of the spreadsheet. And, so many of my students are like, why do we need a spreadsheet for this? I'm like, you will thank me at some point, maybe not in this process. Andy, what do you think about this topic?
I like everything that Alex says. I think for this particular question, it's the proper consultants that are doing the lion's share of the work. And shout out to Mackenzie, who is often compiling the actual supplemental questions. So we do have someone behind the scenes who plays a huge role in this. I'll just say something from the writing perspective, and Alex couldn't be more. It makes what we do really possible to have that kind of organization. But one particular thing that comes up is you'll have an academic interest supplement or 7 of them, and they're all different sizes. So how do you deal with the 150-word version and the 500-word version and the 300-word version as well? So putting aside where those particular colleges rank and those priorities, obviously that would take precedent. But let's just even the playing field and say, you need all of these at the same time. What I like to do is start with the biggest one because we'll get everything out there that we need. And then the process of distillation is a whole lot easier than the process of emendation, assuming that's a word. I don't really know whether that's a word or not, given that I'm a writing person. You get the idea. So I think it's much easier to go from big and to distill than to go from the 100-word version and then try to flesh that out.
That's good advice. I actually think I learned that from working with Holly at some point. She also does the same thing. Holly, what else would you add?
When my goal is to be as efficient as possible with the writing, especially if that's going to be a block with a student, I look among like the early schools, what has the most common prompt and the longest word count. And I will start with that one. So it might be the diverse communities essay, 400 words. That'll be the first one that we're working on. And that way, you're knocking out an essay that's going to work for 5 or 6 schools and go from there. But I like, no, first looking at all the prompts and trying, if you can, to come up with topics for each of them and brainstorming that. I like to do that before writing in general, is just to like have these. And it's okay if there's some blank spots. I find sometimes during the writing process, ideas will come up and the spreadsheet will fill itself out with the content ideas. But yeah, I completely agree. Write long and then distill. These essays really have to pack a punch. And the best way to do that, in my experience, is to write twice as much as you need and then condense.
We don't care about the word count on these early drafts. So many students are sort of blocked by that. Okay, in the interest of time, I want to go to some questions from the audience. So please, if you have questions, type them in the chat or raise your hand and I can call on you to speak it out loud. We have one in the chat right now from Carmen. Her son is applying to UVA. That's his first choice. This year, they got rid of their supplemental essays. There is one for the School of Nursing only, but otherwise there are no supplemental essays for UVA. So how can he make sure to get all this sort of specific enthusiasm for that particular university across? Joanna, let's go to you first.
Thanks, Sheila. That's definitely a tough one. I mean, I'll tell students and, coming out of the gate, I think that the number one thing you can do to signal your interest, your strong interest, is if schools have an early action or an early decision window, is to obviously apply during that window to send that message, particularly if a school is early decision. Obviously, UVA that's not the case for UVA, but for other schools though, that is a great way to send that signal that this is my top choice. I think in other cases like this, and again, UVA is kind of a tough one. If students have if students have, if there are family ties, this is an area sometimes where students might allude to when they think about some of their activities, if there are things that they've been involved with. I've had students who have sometimes subtly referenced things in their personal statement if they're talking about, if it aligns with the topic that they've chosen for their personal statement. But I think that above all else, going to campus, certainly if you're able to, and taking a tour, you can certainly request meetings with the admissions office at some schools. There are some schools, again, UVA doesn't offer the interview, but again, even just being able to show up on campus and see who you might be able to meet certainly could help. A lot of these things are kind of hypotheticals because again, not every school is going to take into consideration demonstrated interest. They're not necessarily going to be tracking all of this, sort of with a fine tooth comb either. But I think most importantly, for the student is really to think about as you submit your application and as you think about your personal statement, in particular, probably for UVA, it would be to think again, do that research, think about the values. In this particular case, if there is, as I mentioned earlier, if there are parts of your story that really resonate with UVA's value, trying to think about how you can really show alignment and fit if it has to be through your personal statement. And maybe that does mean that your personal statement now is you're going to have a different derivative of that personal statement for a specific school. And it does create a little bit more work, but that's really going to be the best way to sort of signal that to a particular school. I think it's really, you really have to handle it on a student case by case basis. And I would love to get Holly and Sheila's thoughts on this too, because especially for students that have so many schools on their list, you're now talking about really exponentially increasing the amount of work. But if this is in fact your son's top choice, I might think about, if the topic of that personal statement, again, it doesn't have to be overt, but thinking about things that are important to UVA, their values, again, all of that research, trying to pick a topic for the personal statement that maybe does align a little bit more closely with some of those values, I think could certainly be one way to signal fit as well.
Yeah, I'm also interested in what Holly's take is on this, but what I want to stress is they made a very intentional decision to get rid of their supplements, right? They've been kind of playing with the format. There were like 11 short answers, and then it was like pick one of these, and now they're just all gone. So they have thought very long and hard about whether they need these or not. There's some strategic reason that they've decided to get rid of them, or maybe it's a political reason because they have been the subject of a lot of scrutiny. So don't try to cheat it and like use the additional information session or send in an email, which is actually a supplemental essay, right? They don't want them. If they wanted them, they would have asked for it. So I think Joanna's advice is really sound here. Holly, anything to add here?
Yep, and they don't track demonstrated interest as well. So like, among them, it's like that's not an important admissions category. And so I think the subtle approach that Joanna mentioned, if you really feel the need to articulate a match, you might not be able to tell that story. That might seem too direct, but alignment with values might be the way to go.
Great. While we wait for more questions from the audience, there was one that came in earlier, which is when should students really be writing the supplements? When is the crunch of writing? When does that begin? I mean, we're having this webinar right now for a reason. It's usually August. A lot of students want to get as much done as they can before the school year starts, when they're going to be really busy and their extracurriculars are going to start up again. But, I've seen people start to tackle these in October, or if they're only applying to regular decision, it may be later than that, November or December. Anyone else want to chime in on when the crunch is?
A lot of rising seniors want to leverage summer as much as possible. And it's tough because obviously Common App doesn't open until August 1st. And every time a student, is like, oh, I'm going to write these really, really specific supplements for my ED school. And then, oops, the supplements change on August 1st. But I do tell students, again, Holly's earlier point, there are a lot of themes, and Andy's, there are a lot of themes that we see, and so it's not a bad idea if you're, especially, if they were working over the summer, or if maybe, your child hasn't gone back to school just yet and has a little more time to start, they can certainly start working on sort of brainstorming more general topics. And this is probably going to be relevant for folks with younger students. You can start brainstorming some broader, more general topics, certainly earlier in the summer. So things like my favorite extracurricular, my academic interest essay, civility, community, things like that. But what I would suggest though is, especially going into the school year where you're starting to balance all of this sort of, with the rigors of senior year too, I would encourage students to not try to tackle too much. And so don't necessarily take on maybe more than 2 or 3 essays at a time, because if you try to do everything at once, or if you tell yourself, hey, I'm just going to take this one weekend, carve it out and try to knock everything out, again, you'll hit a point of sort of diminishing returns too. And so again, I would go through, try to prioritize and pick maybe 2 at a time to work on, and really try to be methodical. Again, that surgical precision is going to be really important here. work on content that you feel really good about before moving on to the next essay topic, especially because each of these, again, as they get more school specific, are going to require more incremental research as well.
Thank you. So just in the interest of time, I would like to tackle Esteban's question, because as you just said, that surgical precision is so important, Joanna. And that's, I think, what Esteban is really asking about. Like, how do we talk about certain things in a specific way and avoid the thing that everybody else is going to say about a specific school? Who wants to chime in on this one?
Yeah, so I guess the surgical precision idea is a close neighbor to that is specificity. So it's not a problem per se to reference big things like values. The key thing, as Sheila was saying earlier, is making the connection with the student unique, right? So it's okay if you're talking about something that is maybe non-unique about the university or that other universities share, but it's all about making that connection sincere, emphasizing the right fit. Yeah, so nothing wrong with talking about how UMich is a great sports school, and that's really exciting, but make that, don't just say that, right? Let's connect that with something that is sort of really important about the student and their values.
Yeah, that's a great point. I would add that you want to make sure whatever you're saying can't be applied to another university, right? So if you're only talking about location and size, well, there are probably I mean, especially if we're talking about a major city, there are other colleges that are there, right? So location may not actually be something super unique, but if there is something about that location that connects to the student, and like that part of Philadelphia versus this part of Philadelphia, right? If we want to get that specific, you could go there and make that unique. Alex, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think what you just said, Sheila, makes sense. And also possibly even like the interaction or the interplay between a couple of those larger features, right? So it's not just all dependent on location, but it's this location combined with these other specific things that make this the place that feels like an academic home for me, an academic and a social home.
I know we're at the end of our talk, but I did want to share a couple of little tidbits and one opportunity. So some major takeaways here. We want to showcase the student strengths and fit. We want to piece all the essay content together. And think about this as a content plan, right? The supplements and the personal statement and the activity list. What are they all coming together to say about this student, and make sure they resonate, not repeat? We also need to make sure we get everything done and done well. So we talked about priorities and timeline and organization. We want to make this fun, a growth opportunity for the student to reflect on what their actual values are and how they articulate that, how they've demonstrated that in the past. And then, one of my big things is I want to reduce the stress in your household, right? So investing in a plan up front, getting some help from someone like Holly or Joanna or Alex or Andy can really, really help. And it's not that every student needs handholding throughout the whole thing. Maybe it's just a little bit of strategic advice up front, or maybe it's help in the revision process or help choosing the topic. But don't be afraid to ask for help. Probably have people in your life that you could also ask, English teachers, friends who've been through the process recently, et cetera, et cetera. So think about that. And again, please get in touch with any questions you have, and we're here to help you. Good luck to you and your students. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, panelists.
Well, I hope you found that helpful. All of my team is ready to help if you need it. So please don't be shy in asking for help. This is a tough time of year. School is starting, transitions are always hard, and the college application deadlines are starting to loom for some students. So we really want to make sure you get the support you need. If you're an educator or counselor, of course, feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to connect. All right, everybody, take care, and we'll see you next time.